The daf is daf Lamed Beis, Communion Lev, and we'll begin on Lamed Aleph Lamed Beis, if you count up approximately 12 lines of Amar Shmuel. Osamos shebekarka matir, avalo mafkia velo chosek. We're talking about doors that open up into subterranean burrows or different kinds of caves and so forth and so on, where they kept storage. And these doors are connected to the karka with ropes. And Shmuel says that you're allowed to take apart these ropes on Yontiv. And the reason for that is because although there's a malacha called matir, but that does not apply unless you have a kesher shel kayoma, permanent knot. The knots on these doors were made in such a way that it wasn't kesher shel kayom. It's made in such a way that you untie the knot when you go in, tie it when you go out, and so forth and so on. However, what you are prohibited from doing is called mafkia, which means to take apart the very structure of these ropes that are tied down. In other words, whatever ties these ropes down to the doors, you're not allowed to take that off, because that kesher is a kesher shel kayoma. Or chotef, you're not allowed to cut it down with a knife. And in these cases, he's chayav mishum meleches soser. And all this is predicated on the metzius, on the reality that these are binyanim, these are structures that are connected to the karka, and therefore they are subject to the malachos of bona and soser. However, shebekalim, if we're talking about utensils that are obviously not connected to the karka, to the ground, for example, let's say you have a closet, a movable closet, and it's locked with a knot, a rope that is knotted. Matir umafkia v'chosek. In this case, not only are you permitted to untie the knots because it's not a kesher shel kayama, but moreover, there's no possibility of violating meleches bona or soser because we're talking about kalim. And we're holding now that there's no Torah's bona and certainly not soser in the case of kalim because they're not connected to the karka. Therefore, in this case, even to be mafkia, to simply take apart the connection between the kli and the rope, that itself is mutter, and you can cut it down as well. And all this is mutter, says Shmuel, echad Shabbos v'echad b'yontif. It matters not whether we're talking about Yontif or even on Shabbos. Meisvei, the following brisa is being quoted as an objection to Shmuel's statement that there's an Iser stira min haTorah. The brisa says, "Chosama shebekarka b'Shabbos matir, avolo mafkia v'lo chosech, ach b'Yontif matir umafkia v'chosech." Now here we're talking about the ropes that tie down the doors themselves. And yet, even though it's karka, nevertheless, the brisa is matir, taking apart the knots. And in the case of Yontif, even to be mafkia v'chosek, even to remove that very connection between the ropes and these chosamos, these dalse, pispe, boros, ma'oros. Even that's permissible. And apparently the reason for this is because, all right, on Shabbos we're dealing with an Isa D'Rabbanan of Stira D'Rabbanan. On Yontif, they were matir for the sake of Simchas Yontif. So this is again Shmuel. Shmuel says it's prohibited even on Yontif. And the Gemara answers, Hamani, this brisa reflects the Shita Rabbi Meir. The Omar, Rabbi Meir says in our Mishnah that on Yontif, af poches lechatchila, you're allowed to be soser even lechatchila. And we're talking about a bayis sosum, it's closed and it's full of peiros. V'notel, you're allowed to remove the peiros from inside. So we see that this stira is only prohibited midrabana, and therefore on Yontif, for the sake of Simchas Yontif, they were matir upligi rabbanan aleh. However, don't raise an objection to Shmuel because, in fact, the Chachamim rejected Rabbi Meir, and they hold that even in a case where the Isa Stira of the bias is only D'Rabbanan, nevertheless, it's still prohibited on Yontif, and Simchas Yontif is not enough to trump the Isa D'Rabbanan of Stira. Vanandi Amri D'Rabbanan, and Shmuel says that I reflect the Shita of the Rabbanan, that you're not allowed to be soser chosamos of karka, even though it's only a stira d'Rabbanan, and even on Yontif it's prohibited. Because I hold that the Chachamim against Rabbi Meir, and the Chachamim took a stricter view. So the Gemara right away asks the following kash on this last answer: Mi pligi Rabbanan alei, is it really true that the Rabbanan rejected the shita of Rabbi Meir, even with regard to chosamas shebekarka? And yet, for Asanya, we have a brisa. Modim chacham Rabbi Meir b'chosamas shebekarka shebeshabbos matir avolo mafkia v'lo chosech ubiyontiv matir umafkia b'chosech. We see clearly that according to the Chachamim, even the Chacham agree that all these Isurim are only D'Rabbanan, and therefore the brisa of the Chachamim would reflect again a heter on Yontif, and we don't have to interpret this brisa that has a leniency of being mafkia on Yontif and attribute that to Rabbi Meir and only to Rabbi Meir. Even the Chachamim, there's a universal agreement about this. And once again, now we have a complete contradiction to Shmuel, who prohibits being soser chosamos even on Yontif. And now we start Daf Lamed Beis. Gemara defends Shmuel. Udi Omar, Shmuel's opinion reflects Ki Haitana, the author of the following brisa, that's going to maintain, like Shmuel, that even on Yontif, we're not allowed to be mafkia or chotech chosamos shebekarka. Nisanya chosamos shebekarka matir avolo mafkia v'lo chosech. Echad Shabbos v'echad Yontif. Be chosamos shebekli Shabbos matir avolo mafkia v'lo chosech. Ubiyontif matir umafkia v'chosech. Now let's go back to the Reisha of this price, and then we'll get to the Sefer subsequently. According to the Reisha of this price, we really have a very fine answer to defend Shmuel, because we see that in the case of Chosamas Shebekarka, although we allow unraveling the knot of the rope, that's called mutal hatir, but lo lafkia v'lachta, that's prohibited. So we now have a very fine support, from the Reisha of the Brisa, but the Gemara points out, Reisha, you have a very fine leg to stand on, Shmuel, with regard to the Reisha of this Brisa. And Chosama Shebekarka also lafkia v'lachta, even on Yontif, they'll safe on. But wait a second, Shmuel went a step further. Shmuel said in the case of Chosama Shebekelim, mutal lafkia v'lachta, even on Shabbos. Kasha. So this is against the Sefer of the Brisa. I got something stuck, I apologize. Because the Brisa clearly states that on Shabbos, you're not allowed to be mafkia or chotech, and only on Yontif is mutter. Whereas Shmuel said it was mutter in the case of Kelim, for so much of Kelim, even mafkia v'lachtoch on Shabbos. Where it answers that even the Tana of this Beitza would concede that there's no Isa Stira in the case of Hafkas, V'chituch, Chotomos, Sheb Bekarka. Sheb Bekalim, sorry. And that would support Shmuel. It says in the Beitza that's also to be mafkia v'lachtov. That's because he's doing it with a knife, and the Beitza holds that you're not allowed to be metaltel a knife for the purpose of cutting down the ropes. Why? On money, this Beitza reflects the Shita of Nehemiah. The Omar kol kelim emi tolim ella b'derech tashmishon. That each keli has its designated function, and you're not allowed to be metaltel the keli to use it for a different function according to Rabbi Nehemiah. And a knife is used to cut meat and food. It's not used to cut rope. And therefore, according to Rabbi Nehemiah, you can't move the knife in order to cut the rope. That's why the Beitza is of the opinion that to be mafkia or lichtal chevel Shabbos is awesome. Why? I'll have to see about Yom Tov in a minute. Because the sakin is not miyuchad for cutting chosamos. It's mukta, or at least it's an isatiltal, as far as that's concerned. Rabbi Nehemiah, the Gemara objects, my area Shabbos. Why are you telling me it's also on Shabbos? Is afilu Yom Tov nami. Be also even on Yom Tov. If you'll argue, Shanyale leRebbi Nehemiah bein shvus the Shabbos l'shvus the Yom Tov. Rebbe Nehemiah is more machmir with regard to Shabbos than he is with regard to Yom Tov. And he's not going to be as machmir in Yom Tov because Yom Tov is only in Isolav as he would be in Shabbos. In Yom Tov, Nehemiah holds that you're allowed to move kelim, even if it's shalol tzor tashmishon, even if it's not for its designated purpose, as long as it's malachto leheta. So therefore, we can say that this Beitza reflects the shita of Nehemiah. Mara says, no, Mishanyula. Does Rabbi Nehemiah really differentiate between Shabbos and Yom Tov? But Tani Chado, we have a steer in two Beitzas, actually three Beitzas. The first Beitza says, Masikin b'kelim v'ein masikin b'shivrei kelim. We're allowed to use wooden utensils as fuel for a fire on Yom Tov to keep up the oven. But according to this Beitza, we are enjoined from using shviras kelim shenishku. If the keli broke on Yom Tov, we're not allowed to use it. It's mukta. It's also betiltul. And the reason for that is because going into Yom Tov, it was not designated for use as hasaka, as fuel. And this reflects, as we'll soon see, the Shita Rabbi Yehuda with regard to mukta and nola. So when the keli breaks and now it only use its wood for firewood, it's a brand new entity that didn't exist on Erev Yom Tov. Tanya Idoch, in the second Beitza, Masikin bein kelim bein chivrei kelim. We're allowed to use as fuel both the wooden keli itself in its full form or in its broken form as shattered shards. Tanya Idoch, a third Beitza says, ein mafkiin, ein masikin. We don't use the keli as fuel to burn the fire on Yom Tov at all. Lo b'kelim v'lo b'shivrei kelim. And we gave the following answer to reconcile these three Beitzas. Meshani, it's the Gemara at the end of Masechet Shabbos. Dalid lo kasha. The first Beitza reflects the Shita Rabbi Yehuda, who holds that mukta and nola is also betiltul, and kelim shleimim are not mukta. You're allowed to be metaltal them, and therefore you're allowed to use them as fuel. But kelim shenishku b'Yom Tov, they are considered like a new entity that's born into the world. They have the status of nolad and mukta, and therefore they're also betilta. That's the first Beitza. The second Beitza reflects the Shita Rabbi Shimon. There's no Isur mukta and nolad. And therefore, you're allowed to be metaltal, even Shivrei Kalim, to use them as fuel. And the third brisa, Rab Nechemi reflects the sheet Rab Nechemia that Kalim cannot be used unless the tzorkat shemam yuchad lehem. And clearly these Kalim, for example, Kalim Shleimim, are designated as Kalim, but not as fuel to throw into the fire. And therefore, even Kalim Shleimim are osur basa. We see clearly that Rab Nechemia prohibits tiltul l'kli even on Yontif. And that avenue of defending Shmuel is now closed. So once again, we don't understand. The Brisa made a chiluk, a distinction between Chos Moshe B'Kelim, between Shabbos and Yontif. My answer is, you know what? We can interpret this Brisa as reflecting Rab Nechemia. We're going to differentiate between Chos Moshe B'Kelim, between Shabbos and Yontif. And Rabbi Nechemia is going to be matir on Yontif. We had a proof from a different price that Rabbi Nechemia prohibits it even on Yontif. Trei Tanoi Aliba to Rabbi Nechemia. There are two traditions that have been transmitted about the view of Rabbi Nechemia. And this is a bona fide dispute about Rabbi Nechemia. One brisa was matul afkia v'lachto chosmos by using a sakin on Yontif. That brisa holds, and on Yontif Rabbi Nechemia was matul tiltul l'kli shelo l'tzorech hashmicha. The other brisa is of the opinion that Rabbi Nechemia holds that the tiltul l'kli shelo l'tzorech hashmicha miyuchad applies even on Yontif. And now we get to the Mishnah. Ein pochasin es haner. In the old days, when they used to create a ner, what they would do is they had what's called the igule afar, and they had mounds of dirt, and they would knead the dirt with dough. And in order to create a receptacle for shemen, the oil that would light in the ner, and for, of course, the psila, the wick, they would take their fist and dig it into these igule offer. And that would create the receptacle of the kli, of the ner. And you're not allowed to do this on Yontif. Mipneshu ose kli. He's creating a kli. And apparently, even if you hold that ain binyan b'kelim, that there's no Torah's binyan in kelim, but if you're creating a kli that didn't exist before, that would be a malach of bon. Likewise, ain osim pechamim b'yontif. What you have is you have coals, and you want to put them out, extinguishing them, and that creates something called pecham, which can be relit. And once again, it's considered as if you created a new kli. Why is that so? Because in the creation of a golden kli, what they do is they use this pecham, and the pecham is used for what's called tziruf hazah. It gives a certain strength to the gold. And mechazik es hazah. And this apparently is an isur makabepat. We're not talking about boneh, ain binyan v'kelim, ustir v'kelim. Now, that's the interpretation of the Pnei Yoshua, and that's how he understands Rashi, in which case, then we could say that even in the Reisha about Pochasin es haner, we're not dealing with Meleches boneh, because ain't binyan v'kelim, but rather with Meleches makabepat. Mishnah continues, the ein chotchim es hapsilo. You have a very long wick. And he made this wick and he prepared it on Erev Yontif. Now on Yontif, he wants to cut it down, make out of 1 wick 2 wicks. And once again, this is considered as if he's creating a new kli, because now you have shtei psilos, 2 wicks that are suitable for hadlaka for life. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, chotcha ba'ur. He could do a strange, unusual way of cutting down this wick that's too long, and he could use the fire. So he stretches the wick over the fire, and the fire burns and separates the wick into two sections. That's permissible. Now, once again, as we start the Gemara, we'll talk about the way they created a ner back into the time of the Chachamim, and it entailed socking with your fist into the gule, into these round earthenware structures made of what we call cheres or ofar. And that's how they created a receptacle for the shemen and the psila of the ner. Afterwards, they would be mitzaref and strengthen the kli that's now made of just soft kind of clay, if you will, by putting it into the fire. That's called tziruf, or in modern Hebrew, chizuk, lechazik es hakli. And the Gemara wants to now clarify who is the Tana who holds that creating a base kibul for a ner is considered like you created a kli, even though you haven't yet strengthened it through the heat of the oven or the fire. Man Tana de b'chisas ner monahu, that if you created a receptacle for a ner, and you could put the shemen there and the wicks there, even before he was machazik and he strengthened it in the oven, he burnt it in, so to speak, heated it up at a tremendously high heat in the oven, and yet it's monahu, it's considered a kli, and it's prohibited on Yontif. So b'chisas ner is creating a kli. Omer of Yosef, Rabbi Meir. This would have to reflect the sheet of Rabbi Meir. The Sanya we learned in the Beitza, kli cheres, earthenware. May emasai, when is it considered a kli makabel tuma? Misha nigmara malachta. In other words, he completed the malach of making it into a base kibul, even though he hasn't yet strengthened it in the oven. Divrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yeshua disagrees, and he says, no, it's not considered a kli just because he made a base kibul out of it. Ella, but rather, sheyitzarfo b'kivshon. He's got to put it in the furnace and strengthen the utensil. Otherwise, that's not considered a kli. It's not a monah, and therefore, you would not be chayav for creating such a base kibul before you machazik in a tana. And therefore, we would certainly assume that our Mishnah would reflect the shita of Rabbi Meir rather than that of Rabbi Yeshua. Because according to Rabbi Meir, once you create a base kibul, it's already considered a kli. That was the thesis of Rabbi Yosef, which Abaye is now going to attack. Amalei Abaye turns to Rabbi Yosef, Mimai. How do you know that according to Rabbi Meir, a ner is considered a kli when you create a base kibul, even before you dry it and heat it in the furnace? And it's like, in that sense, a kli cheres. Dilma adkan lokam Rabbi Meir hasam. When did Rabbi Meir say in the Beitza with regard to Kabbalah's tuma b'kli cheres? Then once you create a base kibul, it's considered a kli, even before tziruf kivshon. That's only Ella. That's only in a kli cheres gadol, a very large earthenware vessel. Sha'af imlo nisyabesh b'tanur, even though he hasn't yet strengthened it in an oven. You can not pour liquids like mayim or yayin, because that would already cause the memis of the ofar, which is still soft. He's going to dissolve that dirt, but nevertheless it's considered kli. Why? Because it is suitable not for liquids, but for solids, a davar yavesh, like, for example, peros. But in our Mishnah, we're talking about a ner, which is a very small kli, and if you haven't heated it up in the hot furnace or the oven, then it's not roy, it's not suitable for shemen. Shemen is again a liquid, and you need it for the purpose of putting shemen in so you can light the ner. And lamai chazit. Well, what can you do with this small kli? It's not suitable for anything. And therefore, it's quite possible that even according to Rabbi Meir, a ner is not considered a kli until after tziruf b'tana. So we're now back to our original question: who is the tana that holds that you're not allowed to make a beis kibul and a ner on yontiv because he's creating a kli? And the Gemara answers to defend Rabbi Yosef that even a ner that he dug into it and he created a receptacle, a beis kibul, it's considered a kli even before he strengthens it in an oven. Why? Because it's royal kabuli beipshite. He can put prutos, meaning small coins that are made of silver or other metals, and they are dry. And that's what you can do with it. It's suitable for a function. Lachain, therefore, Rabbi Meir says you're not allowed to make a beis kibul even in a ner on yontif, and our Mishnah reflects the shita of Rabbi Meir. Ika diamri. Now we have a different transmission of Rabbi Yosef and the question, the objection of Abaye. There are those who say that the Tan of Mishnah, who holds that creating a beis kibul in a ner is considered as if he created a kli, even though he hasn't yet strengthened it in the oven. Omar Rav Yosef, Rabbi Eliezer, Reb Tzadiki. Then we go into the Mishnah, second parak of Elios. Ilfasin charonios tahoros yolamis. So we're talking about karos, which are platters or bowls, and they belong to the city people, the population that lives in the city. And they would stretch out blocks of cheres in order to make them into karos and eat from them. And before they made it into gave it a tzuras kli, and certainly before they strengthened it in the oven, they would eat from it basar and tahoros the olamis. They're not makabel tuma because they don't have a beis kibul yet. So again, we're talking about ilfasin charonios. So these are karos that are pretty much flat out. And he hasn't yet made it into a kli kibul. And tahoros b'olam mes, it's not makabel tumah. It doesn't have a beis kibul. With regard to an olam mes, the Torah says in Parashas Chukas, v'chol kli pasua. And that implies that kli cheres becomes tummy and olam mes, but only when it has a pesach and it has a beis kibul. But nevertheless, utmeos b'masa hazav. If a zav would carry them, they become tmeos. Because a zav is metame kli cheres with tumas hesed, when he leans on it or he takes it from one place to the other. So in this particular way or reality, then there'll be a tumah mibachutz, even though there's no kli kibul, as long as it's considered a kli. And these karos, since it's derech tashmishan, as far as the ayoros is concerned, even without a kli kibul, therefore for sure it's considered a kli, and it's makabel tumah. And that's the shita of the Tanakam. Rabbi Elazar Tzadok Omer disagrees, and he says there's no tumah. Af tahoros b'maso hazav, even if they're carried by a zav, leaned on by a zav, they remain tahoros. Why is that? Lefi shelo nigmar malachta, because he hasn't yet completed the malach of the kli, creating the kli with a receptacle of beis kibul, and therefore it's not considered a kli at all. Hence, it's not makabel tumah at all. But it seems that Rabbi Elazar Reb Tzadok hold that after he finishes the kli and he makes the beis kibul, even though he hasn't yet strengthened the kli in the furnace, a hot furnace, they would be tmeos because they became kalim. And whether or not a a utensil is a utensil. Alpidin is a kli alpidin. Depends upon whether he made a base kibul. Our Mishnah holds that asiyas base kibul in there is considered asiyas akli, even though he hasn't strengthened it in the oven. That would certainly reflect the shita of Rabbi Eliezer Bereb Tzaddik. In the Mishnah in Edios, so Abai raises the following objection. Omar Abai, Omar Abai turns to Rabbi Yosef and says, Dilma, perhaps Ad Kan Loka Omar, Rabbi Eliezer Bereb Tzaddik Osam, that which Rabbi Eliezer Bereb Tzaddik said in the Bryce with regard to Kabbalah's Tumen Karos made of Cheres, of the Bnei Ayoros, that creating a base kibul is already considered as if he created a kli, even though he didn't do tziruf be'esh, he hasn't yet strengthened in the fire. He never said that lo amar tzos ella, but rather only in the case of kelim gedolim, the karos elu, the chazi lekabule be'midi, that you can put at least dry items like peros inside these karos. Aval hachal amay chazi. But here in the case of a ner, before he strengthens the ner and the clay, we'll call it, that makes the ner is not dry, what's it suitable for? It's a small clay and basically has no function whatsoever because you can't put in shemen, which is a davar, because as we said before, it's going to cause the disintegration since there wasn't a heating process yet implemented. And therefore, it's possible that even Rabbi Eliezer Bereb Tzaddik would concede that it's not considered a kli as long as it didn't get dried in the oven. So therefore, we swing back to our original question: who is the Tana who holds that you're not allowed to make a base kibul in a ner on Yom Tif because he's creating a kli, even though it's before tziruf be'esh? Our answer is that even in the case of a ner that's a kli katan, a very small utensil, it still can function for a davar yovich, even before you dried it in the oven. L'kabule be'pshite, because you can put small silver coins inside of it. And that's why Rabbi Eliezer Bereb Tzaddik holds that even though a ner is considered a kli before it's tziruf b'tanur, that is the logic of Rabbi Eliezer, and our Mishnah reflects the shita Rabbi Eliezer Bereb Tzaddik. We learned to the Bryce saying, "Pochasin is a ner, v'ein osin ilfasin charonios b'yantif." Rabbi Shimon Gamliel matir b'ilfasin charonios. So once again, you're not allowed to punch this igul of ofar and mayim in order to create a ner, in order to create a base kibul. And beyond that, you're not allowed to create those stretched out, kind of bowls of the Bnei Ayoros. And this is all prohibited on Yot because he's creating a new kli. But Reb Shimon Gamliel allows a leniency for the cases of ilfasin charonios, karos shtuchos shel Bnei Ayoros. My charonios. What does it mean, charonios? Rabbi Yehuda, ilfasin ironios. Okay, so we now know that charonios are ironios. All right. So my ironios. Okay, now tell me what ilfasin ironios are, and then I'll understand what ilfasin charonios are. Amar Abaye tzai chakliyasa. These are caros that are made for the villagers, and they stretch them out, and these belong to the Bnei Akfarim, as we said before, the villagers. The Ayoros eina makpidim shakelim shalom yu noim ulekach ochlim bohem af kodem sha'osim len beis kibul v'kodem she'nitzafu b'esh. So it seems like the villagers were, again, I don't want to use a negative pejorative word like primitive, but relative to the urban dwellers, they weren't so mocked on their kalim to make them, produce them, manufacture them so beautifully. And they would eat from a kara even when it doesn't have a base kibbutz. Mishnah says, "Ein usim pechame b'yantiv shita lemay chazi." Why did the Mishnah have to teach me this halacha? What can you do with pechamim on yantiv? The Gemara answers, "Tani Rabbi Chia lo nitzacha ella lemosran leol yarin." Ol yarin are those who heat up the bathhouses, and they will use pechamim lebo bayom, and they're using it even on Yom Tov itself. And in this particular way, you could be matir since it's a tzarech Yom Tov. And the Tana now tells me a chiddush that's awesome because it's nireh, looks like osezos. He's doing this litzarech tzarfei zav, for the purpose of those who are in charge of purifying zav, taking out its impurities. And that's not l'tzorech yont. So the Gemara asks, are you telling me that we should be matik to create pechamim b'yontif for the machamim merchatzos, those who heat up the bathhouses, excuse me, of bo bayom mishari? Are you allowed to heat up these bathhouses on yontif? After all, we have a gzera, a rabbinic institution of rechitza b'mayim chamin. We don't wash and bathe our bodies in hot, neither on Shabbos nor on Yom Tov, even if he heated it up on Erev Shabbos or Erev Yom Tov. How much more so if he heated up on Yom Tov itself? So the Gemara asks the following question, raises the following objection. From your answer, it would seem that we could be matir pechamim on Yom Tov for the sake of the balonim, meaning those people who are in charge of heating up the base merchatzah. Are we allowed to do this on Yom Tov? What about the gzera of rechitza b'mayim cham, which is prohibited on Shabbos and Yom Tov, even if the waters were heated up on Erev Yom Tov? And how much more so if they're heated up on Yom Tov? And the Gemara answers, Kidam Rava, based on a statement of Rava in Masechet Brachos Daf Chav Zayin Amud Beis. He wants to be miyashev and give an answer to the question of Rebbe who went into the Beis HaMerchas Shabbos in order to bathe when it was after the Gzera of Rechitza. And Rava said he didn't go into the Beis HaMerchas to wash his body, but rather lazia. He only went to what we would call today a schwitzbad, a sauna. He wanted his body to be heated up in the Beis HaMerchas, the Kodem HaGzera. And this took place at a time period of Rebbe before the Gzera that we don't go into a Merchatz even for the purpose of sweating. Achenami. Here too we should say that when it says that there's a room to be lenient for asiyas pamim for the purpose of machame merchatzos on Yontif, that's kimishtamshim b'hem lechamim es beis hamerchatz. They want to heat up the beis hamerchatz laziyabo in order to get a temperature where the vapors are so high in heat that you could start schwitzing. And because they bring in the pchamim into the beis hamerchatz in order to heat them up, and people will come in now to here in order to sweat it out, so to speak, the schwitzbad, the konim gzera. And this is before the gzera that you're not allowed to schwitz, lazia, on Shabbos night. But nevertheless, the Mishnah prohibits creating pchamim because it's nireh ka'osek kli. It looks like he's creating a kli. Mishnah says, "Ein chotchim es hapsilul shnayim." Rabbi Yehuda omer chotcha bi'or. So the Tanakhama says you're not allowed to cut a long wick into two parts. Ma'ishna b'sakin delo. The Mishnah seems to imply that the only way that you're not allowed to do this chituch is with a sakin. Why is that different than the kavasakin mana? He's being masakin a kli. He had only one psila, and now he made two psilas. And bior nami, even if he does it with the fire, kavasakin mana. He's creating two psilos, which he needs, and he's being masakin the kli. So we therefore don't understand how Rabbi Yehuda would allow lachtoch be'esh. And the Gemara answers, Tani, we learned, Rabbi Chia said, Chotcha bi'ur bifi shtei neros. In other words, a person that has in his hand one psila that's too long, one long wick, and he wants to light two candles. So he can put the two heads of the psila, this two long psila together, into shtei neros, and he lights the psila in the middle, and as a result, the psila will be split in half into two parts. And it's not nirik to Masakin Kli because he's doing this over a fire. El Rakim Madlik Sila. This is where we're going to stop for Daf Lamed Aleph, Amud Aleph, and Mitzvah Shem will continue with Amar Rabbi Nassan on line 3 on Lamed Beis, Amud Beis.